I will start by saying Harry Harding's a very tough act to follow, isn't he? And so it's my dubious honor to do that. He began much of his talk by talking about the many misjudgments and mistakes he made over his career. I want to add one more that he left out. When he first got to Brookings, he had the opportunity to hire a research assistant, and he hired me. And he got better at picking winners after that, including people like Andrew Scovell and Scott Kennedy. But for me, it was a great lead in to my PhD program that led to the book that he referred to during his remarks. So I'll try and live up to both the standard that Harry has set for us and have something new to say here today. So what I'm going to focus on is the retreat from reform that we seem to be seeing in China in recent years, and talk a little bit about elite politics and the economy, but the other speakers on this panel, Yuhua and Meg, are going to talk about those in more detail, so I won't say much about them, focus more on its impact on society and what it may mean for the US and our relationship with China. One of the key attributes of the reform era was decentralization of decision making, where local officials were encouraged, were incentivized to innovate with policy, to experiment with new policies. If they were successful, it would diffuse to other parts of the country. It was often a springboard for their own careers to move up in the system. And that shift of decision making from the center to localities was part of the explanation for why reforms went so quickly and why the economy grew so rapidly during those years. A similar parallel trend was liberalization, of having the state simply be less involved in the economy and society, and particularly the party less involved in everyday life. There's a shift away from the state sector to private firms and NGOs. Both those trends have been dramatically reversed over the past 10 or so years. And along with that reversal has come the retreat from many of the other attributes that we've identified as being key to the reform era, and has an impact both on its the domestic policy in China as well as its foreign affairs. So briefly on elite politics, we've seen what had been a gradually normal procedural transition, a peaceful transition of power has been upended. Term limits and age limits have not been completely eliminated, but clearly weakened. The factional balance that we would normally see at the top has also diminished. So there's essentially simply one faction at the top, and that's Xi's faction. The notion of meritocracy as a way of getting to the top has also been weakened. And in particular, the notion or the practice of what's become known as top-down decision-making, that the initiative for policy, for reforms, for just about everything begins at the very top, and particularly begins with Xi Jinping. The impacts of these different trends in elite politics is a potential for more instability among the elites as people see opportunities for advancement, especially for people who are not hardcore Xi supporters, less limited than it was before. And so as people perceive limits on their ability to rise to higher positions, can be a source of tension among the party elites. There's certainly uncertainty about Xi's successor. He's close to 70 now and obviously can't go on forever, but there's no mechanism in place for choosing a new successor. Less incentive for local innovation, experimentation on economic reforms, and especially for political reforms. So they're much more limited, but nevertheless meaningful in the past. And in particular, less feedback on what is happening throughout the economy and society, and fewer viewpoints represented before decisions get made. As sort of a groupthink mentality and sort of an echo chamber at the top. It's not clear that the more accurate information is being able to influence policymaking. In economic policy, there's been increasing party overreach into this sector, where one of the key attributes of the reform period was decline of party influence in a variety of ways. That has also, at least symbolically, shifted in a couple of key ways. One is seemingly less support for the private sector. The attack on high-tech firms that began about 2 years ago, best example of that, a greater emphasis on party building within private firms. Since we don't have opportunities for doing field research, it's kind of hard to know exactly what those new party organizations are doing in the firms. They used to be there largely to help the firms in their business practices. What they're doing now, are they now the eyes and ears of the party, or are they there just more as window dressing? We won't know until we have more opportunities for field research in China. And all this creates less incentive for innovation. There's been a small but notable trend of capital flight from the country, as many of China's entrepreneurs have given up hope on the future and trying to get both their money and their loved ones out of the country. And a concern among many foreign companies about the business prospects for China going forward. In many ways, whereas the party's goal was to use economic growth as a means of keeping itself in power, the trend now seems to be the party trying to use the economy to pursue goals besides growth, but more concerned about its own survival, and sometimes at the expense of promoting rapid growth. So I want to talk in a bit more detail about its impact on society. After removing politics out of everyday life for most people, it's returning with a vengeance under Xi Jinping. For many people, the party was becoming less and less relevant in much of their daily lives. It wasn't as involved in the workplaces. It wasn't as in your face as it has become now. That's apparent in the return of ideology in China, with Xi Jinping's thought on just about every topic you can imagine. An increasing number of research centers have been established at universities and other locales around the country to study his thought on a wide variety of topics. There's a greater emphasis on ideology in schools, in the media. There are greater restraints on NGOs in the country, including those that have been previously tolerated, those that have been involved in less politically sensitive work like the environment and social welfare. But these are also now under greater scrutiny and greater constraints. There's also an emphasis, as in the private sector firms, of building party organizations within NGOs. And unlike the party's practice of recruiting private entrepreneurs into the party in the past, for leaders in the civil society arena, the heads of NGOs, they have not been targeted for recruitment into the party, not seen as necessarily the kinds of people the party wants in its organization. As another well-known feature of this is the increased use of surveillance throughout the country to monitor where people are, who they're with, what they say, what they do. And this, whereas in the Maoist period, there was also a desire to monitor and control society, but it was an analog political system back then. They didn't have the same capabilities. Now with digital technology, facial recognition software, there's easier ways of monitoring people in real time in ways that were just simply never imaginable in the past. There's a great increase of this during the COVID pandemic. Whether it will decline subsequently, or whether this constant surveillance, the use of QR codes to get in and out of buildings, to get in and out of classrooms, onto buses and everything else, how much that will decline, and whether it will come back at different times when the party feels the need to tighten control remains to be seen. The impacts of this is that with greater party and state controls over most aspects of life, it has caused some resentment from people who've gotten used to the fact that the party and the state were not as prevalent in their life as they are now. And that for people who've grown up only knowing, especially the younger generations who grew up only knowing more relative freedoms in the country, less constant surveillance by the party. This has come as a surprise for older generations who remember some of the past, maybe not so much. But for younger people, this is a dramatic change in what they had come to know. There's greater emphasis on funneling all forms of political participation through formal party channels. As Harry mentioned, one of the big differences between Xi and Mao is that Mao liked chaos, liked to mobilize the masses and have them do his bidding. Xi wants to control the masses and make sure that what they do goes through formally approved institutions that the party can control and limit also the information that flows up to the top. In a wide sense, there's simply less tolerance for the informal institutions, informal practices that had come into play during much of the reform period. Local officials would often cooperate with NGOs, for example, in providing social welfare, in providing legal advice for migrant workers, for providing aspects of poverty relief and disaster relief, often informally because they weren't always registered, but local officials saw the benefits of having them do those things, but now there's less tolerance for that. So what are the consequences for this? Is the resentment of these greater surveillance, especially during the COVID period, is that going to be a permanent decline in the popular support for the party? One of the things that often surprises foreign observers is a high level of sustained support for the party from China's own population. We have anecdotal support of a decline during the COVID years through social media and through other means, but it is really largely anecdotal. We don't have the same type of reliable survey data that we had in the past, and given the political atmosphere in the country, it's unlikely that we will have anytime soon. One key indication of the fact that there may be a shift of opinion among especially young people is that fewer people are applying to join the party now than they used to. Since 2015, there's been a decline in the number of people who wanted to get into the party, also decline in the number that the party accepts into the party. Exactly why that's the case, we don't quite know yet, again, because of the difficulty of doing the type of field research that had become common in the past. Now, all of these things are unforced errors. These were not things that just happened by mistake. They were, the party just didn't stumble into these changes. It has done so intentionally. Some hints that the CCP is pulling back, especially regarding the private sector and the high-tech internet companies like Alibaba and Tencent, have come, especially after the recent National People's Congress, where the Prime Minister was giving lots of reassuring rhetoric that the party still does support the private sector. The recent Global Economic Forum, again, was sending messages both to the Chinese private sector, but also to the international community that China is open for business, ready for business. Whether this is simply rhetoric or a shift of attitude and practice remains to be seen. Some of the implications for the US, I'll just tick off quickly in the interest of time. One is there's this ongoing blame game in both countries about the other country's intent. So during the period of COVID, there was mutual conspiracy theories in both countries about the origins of the disease. Messages in China that the suspicions that it may have in fact begun in the United States and was transported to China. Very much unlike the SARS epidemic, where there is a desire to find out exactly how it started and what to do about it. This plays well in China, this popular nationalism that is so much a part of the recent social media commentary. this notion that the US is out to get China in some ways does seem to play well to the population, but a dangerous tactic to employ. The rhetoric about the US containing China is a longstanding meme that the party promotes. In the past, this always seemed kind of silly. It's kind of hard to imagine how much faster the economy could have grown, how much greater influence it could have had in the international arena. If the US was really trying to contain it, it was doing a very lousy job of it. But that seems to be increasingly true now. There's an effort to limit technology exchanges, other types of trade. There's probably one issue that Republicans and Democrats agree on nowadays, and that is they need to limit everything that comes from China. There's even a story this morning in the Washington Post about efforts to limit the ability of farmland being sold to Chinese individuals and companies. These bans on technology transfer, especially chips and chip making technology, will be a further hindrance to the ability of China's leaders to achieve their national rejuvenation goals. China's always shown the capacity of duplicating foreign technology and often improving upon it, but not often good at creating new technology from scratch. But now it'll be forced to, as part of the Made in 2025 program. That seems to be a key part, and now is being forced to do so by limits on importing technology from abroad. This is a short-term setback. I'll close simply by noting that people who bet against China usually end up being wrong. And so there are challenges that the party faces in China, but it has always been able to somehow adapt enough to deal with them, to survive. And the safe bet seems to be that it will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
We'll first turn the podium over to Meg Rithmire. Meg, the floor is yours.
So thank you for having me. And I'm sorry I can't be there with you all in person, but I enjoyed listening to Professor Harding's address, and also, of course, to Bruce Dickson, whose work I've learned from for decades now. So thanks for having me. My focus will be indeed on the role of the party state in China's economy, and what it means for China's economy, and also what it means for US-China relations, which I will speak about at the end. So I have basically 4 points to cover briefly. One is how should we think about the political economic transition that's been underway in China for some period of time now. I would say it even precedes Xi Jinping, but of course has been amplified under Xi Jinping. And that is a transition to something that my co-authors, Margaret Pearson at the University of Maryland and Kelly Tai at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and I have called party state capitalism. And it very much echoes some of Bruce's remarks about the logic of the party's intervention in the economy and what that underlying logic really is about. The second is talking about this new era of regulation in China and what that means. Third, I want to talk about ideology, and then I'll talk about prospects. So let me start by talking about party state capitalism. And so there was this idea for many years, which Bruce, I think, nicely captured just now, as well as in a lot of his written work, that what the party wanted from the economy was economic growth and dynamism in order to bolster the party's monopoly on political power. That the idea, starting really with Deng Xiaoping, was that as long as the economy is growing, and that it was very important that the CCP, of course, keep a grip on social stability and political stability. But within that context, the key to political stability and longevity would have been economic growth. What I think we're seeing now is a reversal of that idea, or a reconfiguration of those priorities, such that the logic of what happens in the economy, the Chinese economy domestically, as well as with its interactions with the world, the priority is on the political monopoly of power from the Chinese Communist Party, rather than economic growth itself. And so my co-authors and I call this party state capitalism because we think it's different from state capitalism as it's normally conceived. So We were talking about the Eurasia Group and Ian Bremmer a little bit earlier, and this idea, he's written a book about state capitalism, and that term is used to describe modes of economic intervention in states as diverse as Brazil, India, even Norway, Saudi Arabia. Some of those places are liberal democracies, and some of those places, of course, are not. And so state capitalism tends to take on a more sort of nefarious connotation when it applies to authoritarian regimes like China's. But generally, what people have focused on with state capitalism is the role of the state to support national champions or sovereign wealth funds and things like that in globalized sectors. And we argue that the logic of party state capitalism, and I'll tell you how we think that's manifest in just a minute, is not necessarily global competition, but rather really it's about political control. So seeing the economy as a source of political power for the Chinese Communist Party. And so we see that manifested in a few ways. So first is this idea of the party everywhere, which Bruce already covered, party cells. I quite agree that we don't know what the impact of these party cells really is in a variety of firms. We don't know why they have them. We don't know what the role even of having golden shares and sort of controlling minority stakeholders from the party state itself really is on the competitive logic of firms. It's too early to tell, and we just don't know. And I think we would make mistakes if we made immediate inferences about, arguing, for example, that all firms are extensions of the party state. I don't think that that's true at all, but that's certainly one of these trends. A second is really what we call securitization, and that is manifested in a couple of different ways. So seeing basically firms within China and economic behaviors as part of national security. And so most obviously, we've seen a suite of laws that really started in 2013 with the cybersecurity law and national intelligence laws and national security laws and things like that, which have given the state itself and the party really a wide legal purview to intervene in the activities of firms, to commandeer their assets, to compel individuals to cooperate with the party state in issues of national security. And what's very interesting to me, especially, is that national security is really broadly defined. So for example, in the 2015 national security law, financial stability and financial sector stability was identified as a key element of national security. And that was right on the heels of the stock market crisis in 2015, which I think had a really transformative effect on how the CCP was viewing private markets and the riskiness inherent in the behavior of firms in China. And so this suite of laws has made it very difficult, especially for host countries on the outside that have had Chinese investment or trade partners with China, to not see firms as at least potentially extensions of the Chinese party state, because in fact, the laws of the PRC give the state such a right to commandeer assets and intervene in the activities of those firms. And we've also seen the rise of industrial policy in China. And I would point people to Barry Naughton's work, among others, on this. And what's very interesting is that, of course, the Chinese state has been involved in the Chinese economy, in terms of ownership, state ownership, and also subsidies and picking winners and trying to foster the development of competitive firms of all kinds of different ownership types, as Bruce indicated, for a long period of time. But it hasn't really done industrial policy on this scale ever, actually. So the signature campaign is Made in China 2025, which launched officially in 2015. It's not spoken about in those terms anymore in terms of Made in China, but the policies that involve extensive government guidance funds. So these industry funds, which are meant to match state capital with what's called social capital or private capital within the Chinese financial sector, to funnel assets and investment towards firms in frontier sectors, semiconductors, of course, AI, quantum computing, new energy vehicles, a wide variety of new tech sectors emerging in foundational technology. And what's really interesting and quite novel about this new set of policies is that this kind of investment is going to non-state-owned firms, so private sector firms. And that's because the policymakers within the PRC have realized that the next generation of innovative technology is not going to come from these behemoth state-owned industries, right? But they're going to come from dorm rooms, right, in Wudaokou, and from startups in Shenzhen. And so the idea is, because those firms have been systematically excluded from the Chinese financial system for a long period of time, that it was necessary to have new policy instruments like government guidance funds in order to get capital and, in fact, to send signals, right, to venture capital, private equity, and the wide variety of private capital in China, that these were the industries where the state wanted to see resources allocated, which, we're doing that here in the United States now as well, which is quite interesting. But that was really new in China, the idea that it was private sector firms as well as state sector firms that were going to be part of China's very security-oriented, forward-looking set of industrial policies. And so we call this party state capitalism, again, because the logic is really about the survival of the party state itself. And that's a response to both China's external environment. So Made in China 2025, on my reading, is a quite direct response to the Snowden revelations that the US was in fact using its access to high-tech value chains and its dominance in those value chains to spy on Huawei, for example, and the fear that the US and others might weaponize those supply chains against China to constrain China's growth or modernization. The irony, of course, is that China's response to that by Made in China 2025 and the suite of laws that have securitized party control over the economy have produced exactly that outcome. So fear in trading partners and host countries that they needed to actually restrain China from growing in a wide variety of sectors. And so it's been a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, as well as what my co-authors and I identify as a security dilemma between the US and China. But it's not just the external environment. It's also a response to China's and the CCP's own domestic concerns about its economy, which brings me to my second 2 points, which is on the new era of regulation and how we should think about ideology in the role of the party in China's political economy. And so it's very interesting. I quite agree with Bruce that the crackdown on big tech indeed started in 2020. With the suspension of Ant Financial's IPO. And the reading you most often get, and the most salacious reading, is that Jack Ma gave a very incendiary speech and then was punished, and that this is all part of common prosperity, and it's a part of the drive to eliminate the power base or prevent the emergence of a power base by powerful entrepreneurs in China. But in fact, if you look at the series of events that led to the suspension of that IPO, and indeed the crackdown on the financial sector, which did not start this year, it started in 2016 following a financial sector crisis in equity markets in 2015, 2016, and which Bruce also identified, capital exports and capital flight from China. So my favorite fact to tell people is that this period between 2008, really, and 2017, when everyone's writing books about whether China's buying the world and what China's doing in Africa and Latin America and buying up all of these assets in Europe, then in fact the errors and omissions in China's balance of payments, so the money that was leaving China unaccountably and often illegally, was as much, if not more, than China's official outward foreign direct investment during those years, which indicates a deep level of distrust between the private sector and some elements of the public sector, in fact, political officials and people who are close to the regime, insecurity, right, about their view of their future in China, and was noticed by the party state, who thought, what's happening here in the context of the anti-corruption campaign and then the context of financial liberalization is that many actors in China, both on the part of the state officials, as well as members of the private sector, were abusing certain policies of China's, including open capital markets and liberalized financial markets, in order to accrue wealth for themselves and indeed expatriate it and even commit a wide variety of fraud. And so it's important that I think we think of this new era of regulation as not some sort of apotheosis of a long-held plan of Xi Jinping or anyone else to control the Chinese economy and control every aspect of it, but as a response that comes from a genuine fear that actions within the Chinese economy were making the CCP insecure and were making the economy increasingly unstable and unwieldy. And so when I think about, the Ant Financial IPO, for example, it was a company that was being regulated as a tech company, and it was really a bank. And so when that sort of size of those assets under management and the exposure of Chinese households to the behavior and the decisions of that firm which was not being regulated by financial authorities, right? And that fear on the part of the party state coming off the heels of a financial crisis and widespread protests with the peer-to-peer lending platforms and other these financial innovations and vehicles that exposed Chinese households to all kinds of actions from all sorts of people within the Chinese financial sector who are not behaving very well. It's a real genuine sense of fear. And so that new era of regulation, and the most recent of which we've seen with the reorganization of how science and technology will be governed in China and the reorganization of the financial sector, which can be characterized by one word, which is centralization, is really a response to the idea that the regulatory system was not working in China. And I think we should recognize that they're in part right. They're in part right about that it wasn't really working. And so in terms of ideology, it's become very fashionable to call Xi Jinping a committed communist, right? As if, Red China has returned and and he's the new Mao. And certainly Bruce is right. We're seeing this emphasis on Xi Jinping thought. I'm hearing all sorts of things about how every meeting has to start with some reading of the 20th Party Congress documents or some study of Xi Jinping thought. And so certainly that's happened, but I think it's important that we remember that before Xi Jinping seemed to be such a communist, he was saying things that were quite capitalist, right? So markets should allocate resources in China. He was bolstering private equity markets in 2015, trying to get capital to the private sector. And I think the right conclusion is that he became spooked, he and others became spooked by the instability that markets bring. And so have done a very familiar thing in Chinese politics, which is to return to the command and control model of the party state as a solution to the instability of markets, rather than as some manifestation of an ideological project that was hatched years in advance. And so the way I think about it is when he says the expansion of capital has been disorderly, I think we ought to function on the term disorder rather than capital. And so he'll say over and over again, private capital has a place, private businesses have a place, right? But it's the disorderly expansion of that capital that I think is most important. And when we look at critical sectors like finance and banking, and even educational tutoring, we can see ways in which those sectors were riddled with fraud, riddled with instability, and that in fact, there's a quite justified regulatory response to misbehavior and a lack of regulation in those particular sectors. And so I think he still remains incredibly pragmatic, although getting into Xi Jinping's head is definitely the kind of field work we cannot do now or perhaps ever. So let me close briefly by talking about the prospects for the Chinese economy. And I echo almost everything Bruce said, both in terms of not counting them out, but also recognizing that there are significant problems. So the primary problem, and at least this is how the Chinese are thinking about it right now, is the backlash from the West. And that backlash is a response to some actions that China has taken, also a response to American domestic politics and kind of shifting ideas about what America's role will be in the world. But it's obvious with the rise of increasing investment screening mechanisms in the United States and elsewhere, the use of export controls, and the very straightforward justification of those projects and saying we cannot tell the difference between a private Chinese firm and the Chinese state anymore for the purposes of American national security, and therefore these barriers must be erected. And so what we have now is a situation where China is hearing, we won't let you grow no matter what. And we've had some very high profile Chinese academics say in the last couple of weeks that Chinese policymakers think that there's no hope for improving relationships with the United States. And therefore, I suppose the logical extension of that is that there's no point in trying to adopt market-oriented reforms because they will never let us grow. And so what kinds of policy making that might lead to in China, I think is really uncertain and quite scary. So if the idea is that they can't trust the external environment and they can't trust their domestic entrepreneurial class and domestic economic actors, then it seems to me that there are very few limits to what the party state might do in terms of how it governs the economy to try to rehabilitate some of the experimental and kind of independent dynamics that really allowed China's economic growth to happen, right? Not necessarily a miracle, quite easily explained in terms of letting people you kind of follow a market logic. But I think if there are limits to that from the policymakers' mindset, then we're in quite a scary world. They also know what they need to do in terms of reforms within the property sector, within the financial markets. There needs to be clear transparency, disclosure, rule of law regulations within the financial sector. There needs to be fiscal reforms, a property tax. And in fact, they've piloted some of those things early in Xi Jinping's administration, but again, generated some market instability and some backlash from urban households and others. And the party state is not willing to tolerate that. So they're stuck, in my view, in the same reform cycle. On the other hand, we can count back, and it was so interesting to listen to Professor Harding talk about this, but we can look back at various moments in Chinese history and think, there's no way they'll get out of this. There's no way that they have the appetite or the ability, right, to enact the reforms that they need to generate the next generation of investment and innovation. And so I think it's too early to count out that such a thing might be possible. But I will end on the note that this is not the first crackdown on entrepreneurs in China. In fact, it's been happening pretty regularly since the 1950s. And if you look at that moment in the 1950s of state building and trying to rehabilitate the Chinese economy after the war and making certain compromises with the entrepreneurial class, even on the heels of the revolution, and then turning against them in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and once again in the late 1960s. And I think all of this has a lasting impact on the mindset of entrepreneurs in China. So they're used to these waves of accommodation and reprisal. And therefore, when there is a wave of accommodation, they capitalize on it as fast as they can with short time horizons. And I think the more punitive the waves of reprisal get, like they have been in the last several years, the more that mindset is sort of embraced by Chinese entrepreneurs to the detriment of the Chinese economy. And so, so there's not much that's tremendously new here, but the changing external environment and the deepening of that psychology of distrust between the business class and the state will have lasting consequences for what the next generation of market-oriented reformers are able to do and what entrepreneurs are willing to risk in China. So I'll stop there and look forward to what Yuhua has to say.
Thank you so much, Meg. Yuhua, it's our pleasure to welcome you to the Elliott School virtually. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Such an honor to be here. I'm also sorry that I cannot be there in person, but I hope you're all well in DC. I enjoyed all the presentations so far. I really like Professor Harding's keynote speech and also the call to go back to history. That's actually what I'm going to do. I have a few slides. Let me share. So I want to talk about what we are seeing in China, when we have a long-reigning head of state, right? We know that earlier this year, just last month, Xi Jinping has very successfully obtained a third term, right? And this will make Xi Jinping the longest reigning head of state in the history of the People's Republic, because even Mao Zedong was the head of state for only 10 years, from 1949 to 1959. So Xi Jinping will likely be the head of state for at least 15 years, or maybe 20 or 25 years. So I want to focus on this question, that what this means, right? What having a long ruling leader mean for China and also for the world. As Professor Harding mentioned, history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes, right? So one way to think about what will happen to China is to look at what has happened in China. And so my remarks are based on my recent book, which is focusing on imperial China, looking at the politics in the last 2,000 years. So let me start with a fun fact about the Chinese rulers in the last 2,000 years. So here what you are seeing is including all the emperors in Chinese history, from the first emperor, the Qin Shi Huangdi, and also the last emperor in the early 20th century. And then I collected the data, the biographic data of all the emperors. There are about 400 emperors in Chinese history. And then I collected the biographic information of all of them. And then I paid special attention to how they died. And then it turns out that half of the Chinese emperors died peacefully. They just, died of age, died of disease, and then when they were on the throne. But then, unfortunately, the other half died unpeacefully, which means, they were either killed by foreign enemies or killed by mass rebels, and then a significant number of them, actually 1/4 of all the emperors in Chinese history, were assassinated by elites, people around them. And then what you are seeing in this graph is the probability of being deposed by the elites over the last 2,000 years. And you can see in the first half of Imperial China, this probability increased dramatically. And then in the late Tang Dynasty, for example, almost half of the emperors were deposed by the elites. But then this probability reached its peak in the late Tang period and then dramatically declined in the second half of Imperial China up until the Qing Dynasty, when almost no emperors were deposed by the elites. So you do see a dramatic change of fortune, right, for the Chinese rulers in the last 2,000 years. And then the second thing I did in this book is to look at what happened to the government those rulers were governing, right? And then so I particularly paid attention to physical policies and also physical power of the Chinese government in the last 2,000 years. And then just very briefly summarize what you are seeing in these two graphs is in terms of both policies, but also in terms of per capita taxation, we see an increase of the strength of the imperial government in the first half of Imperial China. And then that reached this peak in the year of 1000. And then in the second half of Imperial China, we see a decline of the strength of the Chinese government. And then if you put these two graphs together, just remember, what I showed here and then what's showed here, we do see a very puzzling pattern that is in the last 2,000 years of Chinese history, when you have a strong ruler, that is in the second half of Imperial China, starting from Song Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty, you have a strong ruler who were not deposed by the elites. You have a weak government, right? And then in the first half of Imperial China is the opposite. That is, you have a weak ruler who were deposed all the time by the elites, but then you actually ended up having a very strong government. So that's what I try to explain in this book. And then my argument is the following. That is, I argue that the Chinese rulers in the past, but also today, are facing a dilemma that is, I call a sovereign's dilemma. That is, when they try to stay in power for a very, very long time, they need to fragment the elites, because if they have a very coherent elite, the elite will take collective action against them. So to stay in power, the ruler needs to fragment the elites. But then by fragmenting the elites, this will undermine the strength of the government, because to have a fragmented elite, the elites won't be able to take collective action to make policies to strengthen the government. So this is what I call the sovereign's dilemma. That is, you either can stay in power for very, very long, or you can have a very strong government, but you cannot achieve both goals at the same time, because the type of elites that is required to achieve this both goals is very, very different. Right? So that's the core argument I try to make in my book. And then I just, because of time, I'll just very briefly summarize, what I saw in the last 2,000 years of Chinese history. I use a very special source of data in my book. This is the tomb epitaphs, because every person in the elites, when they died in historical China, the family would ask their friends to write a lengthy eulogy, and then they will carve the lengthy eulogy on the tombstone. So those tombstones survived a long period of time. And then for current researchers like me to collect information on what type of people we are seeing in their families, for example. So I pay particular attention to their kinship network. That is, who they marry their daughter to, who they marry their sons to. And then so using the data I collected, I just want to show you a few slides to just get a sense of what I'm talking about when we talk about elites. So this is what the network of the elites looked like in the Tang Dynasty. This is when the emperors were assassinated all the time, right? So the emperors were in danger all the time. And then this is because a very close-knit network among the elites at the time. You can see on the left, this is the marriage network among all these central government officials in the late Tang Dynasty. And then the people who are included in this graph are the people who held the vice ministerial level or above positions. Basically, they are the central committee members in the Tang Dynasty. You can see everybody was married to everybody else. So their sons and daughters are married. And then every family is embedded in this close-knit marriage network in the late Tang Dynasty. I don't know what happened to these two families. They don't hang out with other people, but you can see most of the central government officials were embedded in this close-knit network. You can also see when we put this network on a map, you can also see that the central elites were all living in the capital areas at the time, Chang'an and Luoyang, currently Xi'an and Luoyang, but also with their network, they were able to connect the local elites in every corner of the Tang Empire. So that's what the elites look like in the Tang Dynasty. And then it makes sense, right, that the Tang emperors were in danger because the elites were so coherent. They were connected with each other. And then they were able to trust each other. They were able to take collective action against the rulers at the time. But in the next century, starting in the Song Dynasty, the structure of the elites changed. I talked about the story about why it changed, but to save time, I'll just show you what it looked like in the next century, in the 11th century, in the Song Dynasty. You can see the same people, right? I include only the people who had vice ministerial level or above positions, and you can see the network is now much fragmented. That is, you have a few people who are connected with each other, but then you start to see holes in this network. That is, there are a lot of people who are not connected with other parts of the elites, and then you start to see a very fragmented elites. That can explain what happened to the Chinese rulers at the time. That is, the Chinese rulers started to enjoy safety and longevity. That is, they are not threatened by the elites, partly because of the fragmentation of the elites. And then this is also part of the strategy of the Chinese rulers. That is, to stay in power, they have to fragment the elites. That's what happened in this period of Chinese history. So the consequences, right? The lessons I guess we learned from Chinese history is for the monarchs to stay in power, right? You need to fragment the elites. You need to have break up their networks. You cannot have them to be connected so closely with each other, right? And then the monarchs can stay in power, can maximize their own personal power. But then as a consequence of this, the elites won't be able to make coherent policies. And also they won't be able to take collective action, to trust each other, to strengthen the government. That's what we are seeing in the second half of Imperial China. So to come back to today, right, to shed some lights on what we are seeing today, on the one hand, we see, this argument made by Susan Shirk that, China is returning to a personalistic rule. That is, Xi Jinping has basically monopolized power. We see more of this in the 20th Party Congress, in the most recent National People's Congress. But also on the other hand, as shown by this paper by Zheran Li and Melanie Mannion, that we are also seeing the decline of networks within the Chinese elites. That is, as Xi has consolidated his power, one of the consequences or one of the strategies that Xi has been using is to break the networks among the Chinese elites. And then I think that has really significant implications for how we understand China in the next 5 or 10 years, because if Xi continues to do this, that is, if Xi tries to consolidate his power by fragmenting the elites, we are going to see many problems within the bureaucracy. That is, in coordination, the Chinese bureaucrats, the Chinese officials, different organizations, different bureaucratic organizations won't be able to coordinate on core policy issues. We have seen some of this already, right? So the end of zero COVID is a very good example that this happened so abrupt, so sudden, that without any preparations, the government announced the end of zero COVID just overnight, right? And then it was chaos in December, January last year and this year. And also the recent balloon scandal, right? We also see that there are some signs that maybe the defense ministry was not even coordinating with the foreign ministry, since the foreign ministry was expecting Secretary of State Blinken, but then the balloons were released by the defense ministry. So we don't see any coordination among the bureaucratic organizations anymore. Probably, as I argue, probably because of the strategy used by Xi Jinping to fragment the elite, to fragment the bureaucracy to stay in power. So That's all I have to say. I'll stop here and then I look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take prerogative as a moderator to just ask an opening question, and then we'll open it up to others in the room here as well. But one takeaway I think in hearing about the transition in the political economy model is the high level of risk, right? We heard Professor Dickson talk about declining party enrollment. We've heard Professor Rithmire talk about errors and emissions in the capital account, large outflows, a very risky, high-scale, state-driven industrial policy. We've heard also Professor Wang about the idea of a fragmented elite leading to inefficiencies from a bureaucratic perspective. The opening question would be, how sustainable is this current model? We heard from earlier Professor Harding talking about the importance of scenario building. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty here, but how sustainable might it be moving forward?
I'll jump in briefly, and thanks, Stephen. It's a great question. I mean, my view is really that we have to think about that dynamically, and so the problem right now is that it's my view that U.S. constraints on China's technology acquisition are so broad right now, such that policymakers within the CCP have concluded that there's no hope for making concessions. And in fact, there's been no concessions asked for, right, by the US government, right? So there's no sense that if China were to take XYZ actions, that they'd have more access to global markets and global supply chains. And so in that context, the sense that I'm getting from China is that it feels like a do or die moment, where now the incentives are very much that they have to succeed in developing their own abilities to do certain things without reliance on the global innovation ecosystem that has traditionally been anchored in the United States and Europe in some ways, although very much with the reliance on China for manufacturing and for the realization of actually making the technology happen, and more recently in innovating a lot of the technology. So I've been reading about the battery sector most recently, which is really fascinating, whereby now US firms have to license technology from Chinese firms in order to manufacture batteries for electric vehicles in the United States as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So we don't have those domestic capabilities, even though we're the ones who invented them a long time ago, because China knows how to manufacture them and we don't, and no one else does. And so to me, that's a fascinating turn of events. But now the incentives are very much towards, why would we try to make concessions or be part of this global innovation ecosystem? They'll never let us participate as long as we have the system that we have. And as soon as that competition seems existential, right? So even the Biden administration has framed it in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism, increased congressional emphasis on the CCP and the idea that it's who governs China rather than how China behaves. That's the fundamental problem. And so within that, it seems very difficult for me to imagine a scenario through which China has an easy time changing course. From my view, the change course, so the risks are profound, right? So the risks within China are of alienating the business class are pretty profound, of alienating the rest of the world are pretty profound. And so what's going to require them to change course, I think, would be a change in the policymaking mindset from inside of China. And I quite agree with Yuhua's observations, based on his quite brilliant historical research, but also in the contemporary period, there's just no voices, right, to say we need to do it a different way. And so this very recent kind of Li Qiang meeting with business leaders and things like that seems to be a kind of little bit of a salve, but it's a Band-Aid on a big wound, in my view. And so those risks of, the structural things that they need to do to shift the economy on better footing, and to stop the kind of political dynamics, the security dilemma dynamics within the United States, or this distrust dynamics within China, they would take much more significant change. And so I think China really is at a moment where what got it here won't get it to the next step. But the prospects of trying to reconfigure that don't seem evident to me. That said, we're always surprised when they end up changing course and doing something different. And so if something happened in the next few years whereby they did dramatically change course, I don't want to say I think that's impossible, but it would take something different than what's happening right now. I don't see Xi Jinping having a change of mindset where suddenly he decides that in fact the party state should back off and they should reverse these laws and let the private sector do what it wants. And so it would take some dramatic action, I think, for that to happen.
I'll add on a little bit to that. This trend of greater role for the party and for the state in economic and social life is not a new development. It goes back to the global financial crisis of again in 2008, where China's leaders said, "Why should we be taking advice from people who almost crashed the global economy? Our approach is so much better." And that sells pretty well in China. They can show the dysfunctionality of American democracy and the challenge that other democracies have faced. So they don't feel that same pressure, perhaps, to kind of change their basic model, their main way of doing things. Within China, there's long been this fascination for the Singapore model of a very controlled polity with a single party really dominating things. It doesn't really scale up to a country the size of China, but always been the desire to somehow learn from that experience. There's also always ambivalence about relying on the private sector for growth, because it's hard to control a very large private sector full of small and medium enterprises. They would much prefer a system like South Korea with these large integrated conglomerates, the chaebol in South Korea. But so there's been this ambivalence all along that's reinforced now with the focus on the monopoly practices in the high tech and other sectors that partly is a regulatory response, in part is a political response, in part it may be a personal response that maybe people like Jack Ma were simply too popular and want to kind of constrain the celebrity that he had. But what we're seeing in these recent years, greater role for the party actually has antecedents that go back for about 15 years.
Can I just very quickly say, in terms of elite politics, I would argue it will be very sustainable for the next 5 or 10 years, as long as Xi Jinping is in power, even for people who are losers in the elite struggle, like Hu Chunhua, who was supposed to be the next president, but then he's now sidelined. It is actually in his best interest to shut up and then just do whatever he has asked him to do. So that's actually a feature of the single party regime, that is, even though there are factions, there are struggles within the single party, but for everyone it is in their best interest, right, to be loyal to the party, because even like Hu Chunhua, he can enjoy all the pensions, all the privileges that he's having by staying in the party. So I think, but then the problem, I think, will happen when succession happens. That is when Xi Jinping has to step down, or in 10 years or in 15 years, I think that's when politics will become really risky. I think we are likely to see a kind of a late 1970s scenario where after Mao died, there will be chaos because everybody will compete for the top position.
I'll open it up for questions from the room. We are fairly tight on time, so maybe we'll take just one or two and then go around to the panelists after. Right over here, and then right over here. 1, 2.
Hello, I'm Sadvik Pandiala. I am a grad student here at GW and a researcher at the Sigrid Center's Rising Powers Initiative. I guess my question for Dr. Rithmire is, with reports of Neitan censorship and restrictions on CNKI, the academic database, there are concerns about the verifiability and the access of data from China. Internally, for officials looking for politically acceptable data for career advancement, and externally for business interests and academic interests in China. What do you think these trends signify? Do these trends signify data transparency being a bigger hurdle in the future for China? And will it have impacts on political careers as well? And yeah.
And we'll also take the question over here too.
Hi, Shahid Yusuf from the Bureau of Dialogue at GW. 2 questions. One is related to the earlier one, that you mentioned that the possibility of doing field research in China is going to become substantially less, and that our understanding of what's happening in China will be probably attenuated going forward, which could affect policymaking in the United States as well. So how does one cope with that? The second question is that, China controls various rare earths or lithium refining APIs as well, and could those be a bargaining chip which the Chinese could use to make the US give concessions with regard to technology affecting semiconductors? Because 40% of APIs do come from China.
So we'll move around to each panelist.
Okay, I'll take the first question. Even before COVID, the atmosphere for doing field research in China was very limited. It was getting worse and worse. Being able to interview local officials saw no incentive to accept interviews with foreign scholars. They would often get invited for tea afterwards to find out what was discussed. For academics, whether it was a social or professional visit, would also be questioned afterwards. So there was a really freeze on the kind of field research that we had before. The use of public opinion surveys really ended 2015, 2016 on the large scale that we had done before. So our ability to actually understand trends in China, not just at the elite level, which we can see in one way, but more relations between state and society, really suffered as a consequence. Now with the country opening again, after COVID, there are some opportunities. There are some brave souls who are going there this summer to do some field research. We don't know what the result will be, how access they'll get, be able to access archives, be able to talk to people. So it's a concern for people like me, less of a concern because I have tenure. But for people who are starting out their careers in grad school or assistant professors who need to earn tenure by doing high quality research that gets published in prominent places, this is a major, major issue. To your other question, relatedly, how does that impact policymaking in the US? This is going to be a very cynical view as Washington for too long. Probably not too much, because I don't think policymakers pay much attention to academic research on China. And there used to be sort of a revolving door between government officials and academia. You work in government for a few years, you go back to university to build up your intellectual capital, go back into the government. That isn't happening. The revolving doors between think tanks in Washington and the government. Very few professors now go into government service the way they was very common among my advisors. So I think in that sense, what scholars know about China or think we know about China doesn't really filter up to policymakers the way we wish it would.
And we'll shift to Professor Wang, actually, because he has to go in a few minutes. So we'll go to him next, and then Professor Rithmire.
Thank you so much. I just want to say about the fieldwork question. Some of my students are starting to go back to China this year, but as Bruce mentioned, I think there's a huge inequality actually among the academics, because the people who are able to go back are usually Chinese nationals. They have the Chinese passport, and then so they are able to go back. And then I actually have students who went back during the pandemic, but they're all Chinese nationals. So I think there will be challenges for people who don't have a Chinese passport. And also at the same time, there's inequality, in terms of ranks. The senior people who have contacts in China are more likely to get interviews than the junior people, so on and so forth. But I do want to leave with an optimistic note that is, it's actually possible to study China without going to China. That is, many younger scholars are studying China in the US, and then that is, for example, Chinese students, Chinese diaspora, Chinese companies, they are in the US. For example, TikTok. If you want to study Chinese companies, you can stay in the US and talk to the US branch of TikTok, and then you can gain a lot of insights about how Chinese companies are dealing with the sanctions, so on and so forth. So I think it's hard to study China, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible to study China. Thank
you. Sure. So thanks for both of these questions, and we all have a lot to say about what to study. I plan to go to China this summer, and I'm hopeful. I think Bruce is right that the world of independent interviews where I could traipse around and talk to regulators and have no problems with that are over. On the other hand, I don't want us to be too pessimistic until basically I think we should see how this year goes, because a lot of us plan to go back to China and see how things work. Although it is a difficult time, and the thing that's really lost is the nuance of it. And so, little things like I can look at the balance of payments and look at the errors and omissions, but were it not for me talking to many people who are quietly saying, well, here's how I get my money out through Macau, or here's how I get my money out, I wouldn't have known to make such a big deal of some of those figures. And so I'm worried we're at risk of reifying this idea that, China works in this particular way and the party is everywhere, and underappreciating the ways in which people are pursuing their own interests, because it's harder to see that without going there and doing that. And I think that's particularly dangerous in the way that Washington sees China right now. On the data question about the financial data and the closure of some of these things, it's really remarkable because at this point, Wall Street has been kind of the only friend to China within the American business community broadly who's willing to say, we love this place, we want to continue to invest. And now Wall Street firms don't have access to the corporate filings and financial data and bond data of Chinese firms. And so what they're doing with this, I don't really know. It was pointed out to me by someone else the other day that this new National Data Bureau, which a lot of this is happening in the name of data security on the China side, just as countries all over the world are worried about data security. And so on the China side, it's interesting that this new data bureau is really under the NDRC, right? So thinking about data as an economic tool of management rather than just a security tool, rather than under parts of the party state that are more interested in security. And there is another kind of cybersecurity action thing that it's not under. And so I think we should pay attention to the ways in which that happens. And my view is that a lot of what's happening is that the financial regulators no longer trust the companies to report accurate data, and they should not, because the companies do not do that. And it's actually much harder than people think to get accurate data on Chinese companies. And I know Deborah Brodigam's there and will be there in the afternoon, but the ways in which we've taken some data for granted because it is available on Chinese investments or Chinese contracts without doing the real field work to figure out exactly how those contracts are structured and exactly how these companies are structured, it's painstaking, right? To figure out what the holding of a company like Hainan Airlines is, it takes months of corporate filings research. And so I kind of welcome this reconfiguration, just briefly, to say, look, we have to do a lot of work to figure out if the data that we're using are the right data in the first place. And so the fact that we don't have access to these off-the-shelf data sets right now, it's sort of sad, but it's an invitation to do more creative data collection, which I agree with you, Yuhua, is possible because China is all over the world now. And so it's easier in some ways to do that research outside of China's borders. And so it's supposed to be hard work for scholars. It's supposed to be hard work to collect this data and get the stories right on how these interactions happen and how these companies work in particular. And so now it's on us to do that hard work in more creative ways than we've done it in the past. And so I share Bruce's anxiety about the younger generation, especially someone who does not yet have tenure. But I was lucky to do field work in an era when I could do it. And those impressions I'll have with me for a long time. And so it's on the rest of us now to make sure that those interactions continue to happen. So that the next generation can have that nuance that we need.
We are just about out of time, but I like that as a closing charge. Let's do the work.